Hello, this is your brain on drugs, and this is the punk rock psychiatrist. So today I've got an exciting episode. We're moving into some different kind of territory. We're getting towards the end of our antidepressants that we're going through, but there's a lot more about antidepressants that we have not discussed yet. So there's going to be a lot more episodes on how to change, how to stop, how effective are they, how they affect different patient populations such as pregnancy and elderly and pediatrics. So there's going to be a lot more, but we've just got a few more medications and two more episodes about antidepressant medications to get through. And up today are the NMDA receptor antagonists. Now, this is an interesting one because it's a much newer class of medications and it's a very different mechanism of action than anything we've discussed before. And I have to be honest with you, I don't have much experience with these. So I may not be able to give you the in-depth kind of personal experience that I have for all the other medications that I do have experience with, but I have done quite a bit of research and I do know a bit about this. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start off with ketamine. So ketamine IV, not approved for depression, but it is an NMDA receptor antagonist. It's FDA approved for as a dissociative anesthetic, so used in procedures, medical procedures to relax patients. It's an animal tranquilizer, used as an anesthetic in surgeries, and it was approved way, way back in 1970. So it's been around for a while. It is a Schedule III controlled substance, and that's because people abuse it, right? So on the street, it's known as Special K, amongst other things, or just K. I watched an interesting documentary about the abuse of ketamine in the UK on YouTube. It was really, really interesting. Apparently, one of the bad effects that you can get from abusing ketamine is it starts to destroy your bladder and you start peeing blood. Not something that you have to worry about if it's being given by a professional at the appropriate doses. These folks are using it to abuse it. They're using it multiple times a day. They're using several grams a day. They're snorting it. A gram will take out a horse. That's what I learned from the video. They gave a horse a gram, and this one guy was like taking 5 grams a day. So you can build up a tolerance to this. So this is an abusable substance. It's a dissociative. It can cause euphoria. It can cause like feeling out of body. A lot of people really enjoy it. So it is and can be abused, but not the way we prescribe it. Okay. It was actually discovered around the late 90s, early 2000s that it had a effect on reducing suicidality. And I remember when I was in medical school, I was listening to a podcast or something about it, where they were just talking about how like they would give this to people in the emergency room and that were suicidal, and then they just weren't suicidal anymore. And when I was a resident out in San Diego, I actually met someone that had been doing this research. So that they had noticed that it does really well making people not feel suicidal anymore, but the effects don't last that long. And so this was kind of early in like how it was like kind of being experimented with. And nowadays, I mean, if you want to get ketamine, it's not difficult to do. There are ketamine clinics all across the United States. I've seen them on billboards, advertised as I've driven across the country. They're everywhere, right? So if you want to get ketamine, and I think this is actually what Matthew Perry from Friends died from, the overdose. He had taken too much ketamine. You know, when you get to be like in the VIP status, sometimes doctors don't tell people no, and they give them way too much, and it can be unsafe. I mean, that's what happened with Michael Jackson too. His doctor was giving him like IV anesthetics to put him to sleep and overdid it. Generally, we don't want to give patients anesthetics for sleep, okay? And we don't want to prescribe outside of the guidelines of what is safe, but it does happen. So this has potential for more danger than like most of the other medications that we've talked about. And the MAOIs and the TCAs have got like some significant risk factors, but the rest of them, not so much, not so much. But this is one that can. All right, so this is one to look out for from a safety, and that's why I haven't really prescribed it. Especially being in the when I was in the military. I mean, this of course we didn't have access to this, and it's really not well worked out like how much needs to be given. There's because this is not FDA approved, insurance companies mostly won't pay for it. In fact, I don't think any insurance companies will pay for ketamine IV for depression. Um, so patients are paying out of pocket, and that's why you can get it easily because you're not messing with insurance. You can just go to your ketamine clinic, say, I'm depressed, I want ketamine, and then they give it to you. And did you need it or not? Who knows? But they will they will take your money, and hopefully, I'm sure most of them are above board, but I'm sure many are not, and they're just like taking advantage of the fact that, oh, I'm giving people a Schedule 3 controlled substance that is potentially abusable. So there's some of that surrounding this. All right, so like I said, early 2000s, they were noticing benefit in helping with suicidality, and just immediately, like, you would take the ketamine and you just don't feel suicidal anymore, and it lasts a few days. And so why might this be? And this, I mean, we're not messing with the monoamines here. This is, I'd mentioned with mirtazapine we don't have the reuptake going on, but here we actually have the very first class of medications that's not involved with the monoamines. So we're not messing with the monoamines at all. So how does this work, right? NMDA is a different chemical in the brain. All right. It's involved in the glutamate system. All right. So it interacts with glutamate, or glutamate is the natural chemical in the brain that interacts with the NMDA receptor. And this is an NMDA receptor antagonist, so it's blocking glutamate. There are actually a few different substances, I believe AMPA, and um, there's a couple more that interact with this receptor. So we're blocking these. So interestingly, this actually has similar effects as ECT. So and both have an effect size quite high. When we're talking about standard antidepressants, we're looking in like the zero point 0.3 range as an effect size, which is relatively low. And I'm going to go into detail on effect size a little bit in a couple episodes from now. But we're looking at like around 2.0 here. That's pretty big. Um, so this is one of the most effective medications that we know of that can help with depression, on kind of the same level as ECT, and maybe a little bit easier. I don't know. ECT, you need an anesthesiologist, you need kind of a procedure room. You need to give time for the patient to recover. This is similar. So, similar to ECT in like the how difficult it is to give it. And then also, but ECT is covered by insurance and this isn't. So what does it do, right? And we don't entirely know, but there's a couple of things that it does that are different than the meds we've talked about in the past. So what we think is that it's likely increasing the levels of BDNF, that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like this great stuff for your brain that helps it grow in amazing ways, right? So increases the levels of BDNF and ultimately increases activity at mTOR, which is another receptor that is being um, researched as a target for antidepressants. And we're going to talk about some of those after we finish the FDA approved ones. I'm going to talk about the ones that are kind of being researched. And mTOR is one of the targets that's being looked at. All right. So mTOR increases protein synthesis at the synapse, which in turn increases synaptogenesis, especially in the prefrontal cortex. So synaptogenesis just means that we're making more connections between neurons, right? So BDNF is kind of this growth factor that helps neurons grow and reach out to other neurons and kind of organizes the brain in a lot healthier way. And this increases that. So that's one way that this works. Another way is it turns on rapid response genes that activate structural genes in the limbic system neurons and start replacing receptors and transporter systems within the cells. That sounds like a mouthful. It sounds like, what does that entirely mean? But it's something that it does in the brain that seems to have positive effect. And we weren't really getting that with our other antidepressants. So some unique stuff going on here. Not quite as easy to understand. And what is ketamine made out of? It's actually a 50-50 racemic mixture of esketamine and R-ketamine. And we've talked about the enantiomers before. And you've got your S, which is your left-handed, and your R, which is your right-handed. And those are actually spelled out, ES ketamine and AR ketamine. So it's a racemic mix. So it's a 50-50 mix of esketamine and R-ketamine. And both of those are metabolized to hydroxynorketamine, and that's going to come up when we talk about meds in the future, because actually hydroxynorketamine is being studied as an antidepressant, the metabolite. All right. So how is this given? Remember I mentioned it's an IV, so it's a 40-minute infusion, and the antidepressant effects occur within 24 hours, so pretty fast. And as I said, I haven't used this before, but I have listened to people talk about this that have used it before, experts that are studying it. And so I can tell you what their general guidelines are on the dosing, because you're not going to find this in like an UpToDate or something, because it's not an FDA approved med. So the dosing that people are using is 0.5 to 1 milligrams per kilogram. That's the weight of the patient, given over 30 to 40-minute infusion, given 2 to 3 times a week for about 2 to 3 weeks. And so this is one that is kind of similar to ECT in that, you give it a little bit more frequently when you first start giving it to them. And then after a while, you space it out and give it less frequently. Um, I mean, for 2 to 3 weeks, maybe you're getting some maintenance once a month after that, maybe not. Maybe if your symptoms worsen again, you get it more frequently again. So there's not really clear guidelines on how to give this. And so these clinics, they're just kind of like figuring it out and talking amongst themselves and looking at some papers that talk about how they've done it. But that's the general guidelines. Um, I know most of you will probably not give this to any patients yourself. I know I will never give this to any patients. However, I think it's important to know about, and it's going to help us understand the next two NMDA receptor antagonist medications that you may prescribe to patients, because they're much easier to do. All right. So also when you're giving this, you're going to want to hold any sedatives or stimulants that the patient is on. And this formulation, ketamine, given as an IV infusion, is 100% bioavailable. That means that all of it is available for use by the body. None of it's wasted. And that's going to be in contrast to our next medication. So that's ketamine. For our next NMDA receptor antagonist, we're going to talk about esketamine. Brand name is Spravato, was FDA approved in 2019. As you may recall, when I was talking about ketamine, esketamine is um, one of the metabolites, or sorry, not one of the metabolites. It's one of the enantiomers of the racemic mixture that makes up ketamine. Okay, and I was actually looking at this yesterday, that Canada, because I was wanting to see, when could this be generic? Because I'm trying to, as we're going through these, almost every med we've talked about up to this point is available as a generic, except the last one we talked about, vortioxetine, and that's one reason why I don't favor it, because I don't really think it's that much better, and it's a lot more expensive. Well, I'm going through these in order of chronological order. So we've reached medications that are not available as generics. And so I wanted to know, when could this be available? And when I was looking, I was seeing that Canada actually didn't even approve this to be like eligible for patent protection, because in Canada, unlike the United States, they view enantiomer or the enantiomers of another substance that's already been approved as not something unique that could be patented in and of itself. And so basically they're saying, this is ketamine. Ketamine's already off patent. You can't patent one of the enantiomers. And in the United States, apparently up until 2007, that was the case as well. So then maybe you would have had a situation where S-citalopram would not have been separately given its patent protection from being made as a generic, because it's an enantiomer of citalopram. But in Canada, they're not playing. The United States has the most, I guess, worst system for keeping costs down of medications. Other countries, they seem to have cheaper meds. They're available more easily. Medical care is cheaper. Everyone knows this, and this is just one of those things where Canada's basically like, nope, we don't think so. You can go ahead and make it, but we're not going to let you have your protection. And apparently, I learned in the United States, like this is all very confusing. Um, Typically, meds will be given patent protection from generics for 20 years after they submitted their application. So you may be wondering, why is it so random, like when this happens? Like it looks like it's around 10, 12 years after the med comes out. And that's because it's 20 years from the time they originally submitted the application. Okay, so that's before the med is actually approved and available for use. So you don't have to wait that entire 20 years to get the generic that's cheaper. On top of that, if it's an enantiomer, it's only given protection for 5 years. So that was another thing I learned that's new. And that applied to esketamine, came out in 2019, which means 2024, that was last year. It could have been generic. It's not, though. I don't know why. I tried to find that out, was not able to figure that out. So let's go ahead and talk about esketamine. Um, Unlike ketamine, it does have FDA approval for two things. And there are two things that we haven't really seen much of in with the other medications we've talked about. So it's one of the few medications that is approved for treatment-resistant depression. So that's, someone has depression, they've taken a couple medications, solid doses, tolerated them, didn't work for them. They didn't have a high enough response. They have treatment-resistant depression. This is approved for that. It's also approved for major depressive disorder with suicidality. So, as I mentioned with ketamine, that suicidality in the ER, they were given the IV in the ER, and the suicidality would go away and they could be sent home. Of course, it would return a few days later, and that's why we've worked out some things where you can continue taking it, right? So this is one of the few medications that specifically does improve suicidality. I think of lithium as the big one that can do that. All right. And unlike ketamine, which is an IV infusion, esketamine is given intranasally. It's given twice a week in the clinic. And then that changes to weekly at week 5. Now, since I don't give this medication, I don't really have a good idea of like how this whole system works. Might you be able to continue the twice a weekly if that's what the patient needed? Could you space it out more than weekly? Perhaps you don't even need to do it weekly after the first month. Um, if you look at the prescribing guidelines, they don't even really give any clear thing. They say twice weekly for 4 weeks, and then they don't really say anything after that. And it's kind of like, oh, you could give it less often for whatever amount of time. It's kind of given up to those that are giving the medication. But the other thing is it has to be given in the clinic. And that is, similar to ketamine. But it's an FDA approved antidepressant. So this is the only FDA approved antidepressant that you can't just pick up at a pharmacy and take on your own. You actually, kind of like methadone for opiate dependence, this is a medication that you have to go to the clinic every single time you take it. And when we're talking about taking it twice a week or weekly, that means you have to go to the office pretty frequently, which may not work out for most people, right? So it's a pretty cumbersome task. And then remember, I also mentioned about ketamine's 100% bioavailable. This is only 30 to 50%. My guess is because ketamine's IV and this is intranasal. That's probably the reason for the decreased bioavailability. So um, it's not quite as readily available in the body as ketamine, but that makes sense. It's also a Schedule 3 controlled substance like ketamine is. And then it has, unfortunately, or, for safety, the REMS is required. So, clozapine is the medication that I at one point was prescribing and had to get certified for REMS. Every medication that has REMS requirements has a different set of rules. Qsimia, the weight loss drug, it, it's just inform the patient of risk of birth defects. Like that's it. That's the only REMS requirement. Like it doesn't have to be like blood tested or a lot of this other stuff. Like clozapine, you had to check blood tests. So REMS basically is just like extra safety precautions, and esketamine's got quite a few. Um, so I've got four things that I dug up are the REMS requirements for esketamine. First, it requires extensive healthcare setting processes to include having an on-site prescriber. The site that gives it has to be registered. There has to be registration in the REMS system for the patient, and then the staff has to get special training. And then there's more stuff. So there's if you want to give Spravato in your clinic, you're going to have to get your clinic certified, your people trained, there's a whole set of requirements. So on top of the fact that this is onerous for the patient to come in to take, it's also onerous for the clinic that's giving it. So I mean, I would suppose that a lot of clinics specialize in this, and they get this down pat, and this becomes like a profitable endeavor for them. But if you're just like, I want to add this to all the other things I do to help patients, but it's not going to be a primary focus for you. That might be harder. I would say if this were a primary focus, it would be something that would be a lot easier to do because you would really specialize in it. But if you only had a onesie twosie patients here or there where you were giving this to, and you had to go through all this stuff to be able to give it, that could be kind of challenging. And so I would say this medication is probably not as readily available as a lot of other ones. The second REMS requirement is there's some patient counseling. So you have to tell the patient a certain set of information about the safety aspects of the medication, the risks that they're taking on. And the third REMS requirement is after the patient is given the medication, they have to be monitored for 2 hours to make sure that they are safe to go home. Um, I'm thinking of another medication, psychiatric medication, where you have to do that. And that medication is Zyprexa olanzapine when given in the long-acting injectable form Relprev, which is not done that often because we have so many other long-acting injectable options. But that's one that we have to monitor to make sure that the patient is not overly sedated and is well enough to leave. But not a REMS requirement for Relprev. It's a black box warning. All right, and then the fourth REMS requirement for esketamine is there's also a bunch of extensive record keeping requirements that I didn't go into detail on. I looked at it. It's like you have to keep this record and this, what dates and the names and the doses, and there's a specific kind of guidelines for how you keep the records. So there's a lot involved in giving this medication. So one wonders, is it even worth it? Let's see. Um, when we're looking at effectiveness, when you look at the effect sizes, it's almost as effective as ketamine. Wow. Okay. This to me presents problem number one. Ketamine is much easier to give, and we're going to find out why. And it's also a little bit more effective. Okay. Remember, it's more bioavailable. We've got esketamine and R-ketamine. Both of them are in there, and they both do something, and they both do turn into the active metabolite. The whole reason why esketamine exists is because, and remember, Canada wasn't having it. Ketamine could not be patented again for as an antidepressant. Like, no, they're like, it's already expired, can't do it. You're gonna, and so they're like, oh, well, let's just distill out the esketamine and get the approval for that. Okay. So the esketamine is a little bit um, less effective product, but it was the only way for them to be able to market it and get it approved. And the other thing about getting something approved is insurance companies tend not to pay for treatments that are not FDA approved unless they are very cheap. So we also wanted to find a way of getting it approved by the insurance companies. So we have lots of administrative crap that we have to deal with in the United States, and I know most other countries don't have to deal with a lot of this stuff that makes the whole medical care system challenging to exist in. All right, so but the good news is almost as effective as ketamine. Unfortunately, it actually requires more treatments to get that effect. So ketamine works quicker. When we're looking at cost, the estimated cost when this medication came out was $32,400 a year versus ketamine $2,500 a year. So substantially more expensive than ketamine. There is a 27 to 50% response rate for treatment-resistant depression. That sounds decent. Most antidepressants are in the 33% range, and that's for regular depression. And this is for treatment resistance up to 50%. So that's potentially great. However, there was actually a study that came out in 2023, and it showed no difference from antidepressant alone after 6 weeks. Okay. So that's kind of unfortunate. That paper was Chen et al., and it was entitled Efficacy and Safety of Flexibly Dosed Esketamine Nasal Spray plus a Newly Initiated Oral Antidepressant in Adult Patients with Treatment-Resistant Depression, a randomized, double-blind, multi-center, active controlled study conducted in China and USA. So I would encourage you to read that article, and what I can tell you is that the article concluded that there was no difference between esketamine and just any antidepressant. Like, I think they did esketamine plus an antidepressant because typically it's added to another antidepressant versus antidepressant alone. So they found no difference at 6 weeks. So potentially we've got some confounding evidence for how effective is this. Currently, there's actually a sublingual formulation that is being investigated for home use. So that will make things substantially easier to deal with than having to go into the clinic to get the intranasal. All right, so now let's go into the adverse effects of esketamine, and there's actually quite a lot. All right, this is a medication that has 5 black box warnings. Not many psychiatric medications have this many black box warnings. Clozapine has 5. Most have 1 or 2. Some have maybe 3. Methadone is at 10, and that's the one that I know of that has the most. But we have 5 black box warnings. So what are they? First one, sedation. And these are mediated, by the way. It sounds bad. Oh, 5 black box warnings. So the reason why we have the REMS requirements and the given clinic and all that stuff is to mediate these. So remember, the patient is in the clinic when they're getting this. So most of these black box warnings are not things that we really need to worry about because we get to monitor the patient. So sedation, we're monitoring them for 2 hours. Second black box warning, dissociation. 41 to 48% of people get this. Well, obviously, this is a dissociative medication. I think there's been kind of some thought on, do you need the dissociation? Like with the psychedelics, do you need the psychedelic experience to get the effect? Do you need the dissociative effect? But you're going to get it. But remember, you're being monitored. Okay. And I'm sure if you're not doing well, you're not going to be sent home. It's not like 2 hours. Okay. See you later. Respiratory depression is another risk. Abuse and misuse. There's less risk for abuse and misuse since you can only take the medication in the clinic under supervision. It's pretty hard to misuse it when you can't take more than you've been prescribed. And then the last one is kind of that generic antidepressant black box warning about suicidal thoughts and behaviors. I'm not even sure, like I said, when we talked about that, they didn't really study this on each individual medication. They just kind of saw it as a pattern with the SSRIs, and then they just applied it to any medication that gets approved for depression, which is interesting because, gepirone and buspirone have very similar mechanisms of action, but gepirone gets the warning and buspirone doesn't because gepirone has the indication for depression. So this is another one, because it has the indication for depression, we have this black box warning. All the antidepressants have that one, but they don't have the other four. But like I said, the other four are ones that we can mediate because we're giving the patient the medication in the office. Now, let's go through some of the other adverse effects. Increased blood pressure, 10 to 15% of people are reporting that. An altered taste, dysgeusia, 19 to 20%. Nausea, 27 to 28%. Vomiting, 9 to 10%. Anxiety, 13 to 15%. Dizziness, 29 to 45%. Headache, 20%. Decreased sensations, 13 to 18%. And sedation, 23 to 29%. Now, those are just the ones that were over 10%. And for most meds, there's only maybe one or two side effects that occur at more than 10% of patients reporting. This one has a lot, and it's got ones 20, 30, 40%. Now, like I said, I don't prescribe this, so could it be that these adverse effects are just kind of experienced at the time it's given and for like an hour afterwards, and then the rest of the time the patient feels fine? Or are these things that they experience the next day or 2 days later? I'm not sure because, like I said, I don't really have experience prescribing this medication, but I definitely wanted to talk about it. All right, so a lot of adverse effects. So we've reached the end of esketamine. What are our advantages and disadvantages? So advantages, we've got the new mechanism of action. Basically, we're taking advantage of the mechanism, the ketamine with the BDNF and the mTOR and all that stuff, right? The more neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, and stuff like that. They reported that there's a higher effect size in their studies. And it's one of the few FDA-approved treatments for treatment-resistant depression, and a home use sublingual may become available in the future. But there are a lot of disadvantages. And when I look at these disadvantages, I kind of compare it to ketamine. So there's conflicting evidence for improved efficacy over standard antidepressants. So, like I said, there was that study that came out in 2023, and it was like, is this even better? And do we really want to go to all this trouble with this medication? I mean, it's huge trouble to get like not even that much better efficacy. And then we already know it's inferior to ketamine. And then the REMS requirements are really difficult. Interestingly, ketamine doesn't have any. And I think that's because ketamine's not approved for depression, though it can be given off label, and it avoids all these REMS requirements. So you don't like, even though hopefully patients are being monitored and all that stuff is happening, you don't have to deal with the paperwork and the training and the registration of the patient and the registration of the facility. Like, you're not dealing with quite as much. I'm sure there's still a lot of complications because this is a intense medication. It's a Schedule 3 and you're giving it IV. So I'm sure there's still like stuff to do, but there's no REMS requirement for ketamine. Even as an anesthetic, there's just not a REMS requirement. So that makes it easier to give, even though it's probably more potent, right? So esketamine is a Schedule 3 controlled substance. So we have that risk of, this is actually the first antidepressant that we've talked about that's approved that is a scheduled substance. A lot of our medications are the benzodiazepines, the barbiturates, the stimulants. There are a handful of psychiatric medications, and then a lot of opiates, which you could consider addiction medicine type of stuff. If you look at the list of scheduled substances, most of those are meds that you could get from a psychiatrist, right? But for antidepressant purposes, this is the first and only one. I mean, ketamine you could consider, but it's not really FDA approved for this. So this is really the only antidepressant medication that is a controlled substance. So that's notable, right? That there's some issues that go along with that. And then the cost, right? Now, when I mentioned before, it's eligible to be generic in 2024, and now it's 2025. So I wonder, why isn't it generic? Is there some complication to that? But like legally, somebody could make a generic of this. But at the same time, ketamine is like over 10 times cheaper. It's like 15 times cheaper than esketamine. And so kind of my conclusion when I'm thinking about this is, I'd rather give someone ketamine than esketamine. I think the only real like benefit is that insurance might cover this, but it won't cover ketamine. And so the patient is paying less. Our healthcare system pays more having esketamine in the mix, but the patient is perhaps paying less. But I mean, $2,500 a year for esketamine, that's $200 a month. You know, a lot of people are pay for their own meds, and that's and if you've got like really really bad depression that doesn't respond to anything, a lot of people would probably be willing to pay $200 a month. But of course, if they could get this for free or for a lot less, that would be the advantage over ketamine. But pretty much everything else, from what I can gather, ketamine is better. It's just not approved. It's just not FDA approved. And the reason why is it can't be. Like, it basically, I mean, it could be, but if the company that made it wanted to get it FDA approved, they'd make no money off of it because it could be available as a generic immediately. That's the problem. Could you get FDA approval for ketamine? Yes, absolutely. But you'd have to pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars on studies that ultimately just got FDA approval for a drug you couldn't market in a brand name form and could be generic immediately. So that's why esketamine exists, because you get around that where you can actually like make money off of something that you've put a lot of work into. Okay. So we got one more NMDA antagonist. This is Dextromethorphan+Bupropion. Brand name is Auvelity. Came out in 2022. This is our newest. No, it's not our newest. Got Gepirone next, but this is one of our newest antidepressants. It's FDA approved for major depressive disorder, and it's got kind of a cool mechanism of action. So dextromethorphan, if most of you are not familiar, this is what's in Robitussin. This is a cough suppressant. That it's a terrible cough suppressant, by the way. It's a placebo at best. It's just not very good at that. I think, the opiates are cough suppressants, or sorry, I think the amphetamines are cough suppressants. Opiates are for diarrhea. This is originally like 100 years ago what these meds were used for. So it's kind of related. I think it's related to the opiates, and the opiates can be used as a cough suppressant. So like codeine, you could use as like a cough suppressant. And this was supposed to be like a less abusable form of an opiate, but it's not really an opiate that could be used as a cough suppressant. But kind of like phenylephrine, when you phenylephrine is similar to pseudoephedrine. Pseudoephedrine helps with as a nasal decongestant, and but it can also be turned into amphetamine. And so phenylephrine was invented to, or at least it was then marketed to replace pseudoephedrine because it could not be turned into that. However, it didn't work, and like just recently, I think last year, the FDA said like phenylephrine no more. Like, it doesn't work. We can't use this thing anymore. So dextromethorphan is kind of similar on the cough suppressant side. It was supposed to be like a safer version that's not abusable, though it is abusable, right? You heard of robotripping, stuff like that. This is something that people that can't get their hands on other harder drugs, like people in the military or kids in high school that might abuse, right? Drink a bottle of cough syrup or something. Okay, so that's one of the components of Auvelity. You got the dextromethorphan. So dextromethorphan is kind of an interesting medication. It's got several qualities. It's got NMDA receptor antagonism, obviously, right? It's actually got some SSRI quality. That's why, there is a risk with MAOIs and a risk with other serotonergic medications for serotonin syndrome. And then it's got sigma-1 agonism, and that can cause altered trafficking of AMPA, increased synthesis of BDNF. It also interferes with pro-inflammatory compounds, so there might be some benefit to that. And I think if you remember, fluvoxamine actually had some sigma-1 and was kind of looked at for helping in COVID, because it's thought that perhaps this sigma-1 could help with getting over some illnesses. So that's what dextromethorphan does. I've actually done a lot of study on dextromethorphan. So as I said, I have not prescribed these medications for as antidepressants, but when I was in the military overseas, we had a lot of dextromethorphan. So if you search me and look for papers that I published, I published a paper on dextromethorphan abuse in Okinawa, and it was pretty rampant. I was seeing patients on inpatient ward that they were trying to, they were depressed, they wanted to kill themselves, and they had been abusing this. People in the ER, ICU, just seeing a lot of it because, when you're overseas in Japan, it's hard to get your hands on other drugs. And then this doesn't show up on the drug screens that we do for military members. And so it was a way for them to abuse a drug without getting caught and getting kicked out of the military or getting thrown in jail in Japan. Right. And so it was just people were buying it out of the store. You can read the article. Whenever I do my substance abuse series episodes, I'm going to have a whole episode on the abuse of dextromethorphan. But I just wanted to kind of throw it out there that I do know quite a bit about dextromethorphan. I've done extensive research. I published a paper on it. And so I actually had this idea for Auvelity before Auvelity came out back in like 2018. I had this idea because some of the patients, they had actually told me, there were a few of them that said that they weren't taking it to get high and hallucinate and dissociate. They were taking it because it helped with their depression. And, I researched how it worked, and I found out, oh yeah, this might actually, it's kind of similar to ketamine. At that time, Esketamine hadn't even come out yet. But I was like, oh, I knew about ketamine, and it was kind of did what ketamine did, and it had the SSRI quality. And I was like, oh, that's very interesting that it could be used that way. And so, and then there's this medication, Nudexa, which came out, I don't know, 2016. Don't quote me on that. It's used for pseudobulbar affect, and it's actually dextromethorphan mixed with quinidine, which is a heart rate control medication. And what quinidine does is it's a 2D6 inhibitor, right? And that's what bupropion is. That's why bupropion is combined with dextromethorphan, because dextromethorphan, if you know, as a cough medicine, you have to take it like 3 times a day not that it works for cough, but like for the medication to stay active all day, right? So you add that 2D6 inhibitor, you don't have to take it as often. And so with Nudexa, they added quinidine, but it makes more sense to add an antidepressant. I actually had the idea of adding fluoxetine as a 2D6 inhibitor. I didn't think about bupropion at the time. I think back then I wasn't even necessarily aware that bupropion was such a strong 2D6 inhibitor. But I knew fluoxetine was. And so I actually gave it to a patient. I actually ordered him cough medicine and gave him fluoxetine. And I had this cool idea that this was going to like help. And he ended up never taking it. And then I got kind of skittish of like, oh, I don't know what the pharmacy's going to think about me giving tons of cough medicine to patients that don't have any respiratory illnesses. Um, and the thing is, to get the amount that you need to work, I have to order like bottles and bottles of this stuff. And I guess in the pharmacy, they only had liquid formulations. We didn't have pill formulations. And so it was kind of cumbersome. And so I gave up on the idea. And then this medication came out a few years later, and I was like, hey, I had that idea. Cool. This might be a really great medication, right? So let's talk a little bit more about it. Like, so I told you what dextromethorphan does, and while an abusable substance, you have to take quite a bit. They would get the pill form at the store. Oddly, we didn't have the pill form available at the pharmacy, but you could buy it at the store. The pill forms that we had available were not, if you wanted just dextromethorphan, it was just liquid available. But if you wanted pill form, it had like Tylenol and stuff mixed in there, and you really don't want other stuff mixed in. But when people are abusing it, usually they would get there would be an antihistamine that was mixed in there. It was chlorpheniramine, so it's like brand name Coricidin. It's dextromethorphan mixed with chlorpheniramine. But of course, you don't, and that's got some anticholinergic effects. You don't want to take high doses of that. That can, make you feel really bad. Pure dextromethorphan is less dangerous, a lot less dangerous than having the other medications mixed in, like Tylenol, ibuprofen, pseudoephedrine, chlorpheniramine, whatever it is that's mixed in there, and that cough and cold medication. And so they were going to the stores on their own, and they'd buy a box, like 16 pills, and they'd take like 16 at a time, and that's what they would use to get high. And so this is much lower doses in the antidepressant version of this, right? And so what bupropion is doing, it's extending the life so that we don't have to take it quite so frequently. The dextromethorphan levels actually are increased by 40-fold, so we actually don't have to take as high of a dose either because we increase their peak levels. The area under the curve is increased by 60-fold. And, I had the idea of fluoxetine, but there's a risk with that because both fluoxetine and dextromethorphan have the serotonergic activity. You're increasing your risk of serotonin syndrome. But as I said in the past, we combine medications quite frequently that could increase this risk, but it's still pretty low risk. But why have that risk at all when you could just use bupropion and not have the risk at all? So I had the idea, but the idea that whoever came up with this had with using bupropion was better than my idea. So hats off to them. And then bupropion is also, as we know, an NDRI antidepressant. So perhaps there's some additional antidepressant effects. And that was why I thought about fluoxetine, because I was looking at quinidine as well. And I was like, because, with the new Dexa, and I thought, do I really want to prescribe somebody an antiarrhythmic medication as a psychiatrist? Because I couldn't give them the combo pill because it was, they didn't have pseudopulper effect. I would have had to create it. And I was like, no, I'm going to give these people bottles of dextromethorphan and mix it with pills of quinidine for heart. I don't want to mess with this. And I was like, hey, fluoxetine's a 2D6 inhibitor. Let's use that. But hey, bupropion is one, and it's even better. All right. So that's what this medication is. All right. So what's good about this? Now, it's only been out for a couple of years. So it came out August 2022. I remember when it came out, I was pretty excited. I was like, hey, I had that idea. I was teaching residents at the time, and I told them about it. It was like I was back in the resident room doing inpatient, and I was like, saw it on the news, and I was like, oh, this is super exciting. So, like, what are the studies that it got approved for say? So one thing they found was that there's a more rapid onset set of symptom relief. So only taking 1 week versus, the typical 4 to 6 weeks that we see with other medications. So it works faster, which kind of makes sense because remember, ketamine works within 24 hours. So that NMDA, that's what we're getting, more rapid, where you have a different mechanism of action there. And then in the study they did, 46.5% versus 16.2% taking bupropion alone achieved remission in 6 weeks trial. So 46% on this med versus 16% of bupropion got remission. However, there's a downside. There was an unpublished trial that showed no difference. So it's not clear if this actually is better or not in the long term. It does appear that it works faster. All right. What are some of the adverse effects? I mean, there's all the adverse effects you might find with like bupropion or dextromethorphan on its own. To highlight a few, somnolence, nausea, dizziness, headache, dry mouth, high blood pressure. And then there, as far as like the symptoms that people get whenever they take too much dextromethorphan, there's up to this point, as far as I'm aware, no cases of psychosis, serotonin syndrome, dissociation, or addictive behaviors. So at the doses that are being given here, we're not having those risks. All right. How is this dosed? All right. So it's a little bit different. So there's one pill of this is 45 milligrams of dextromethorphan and 105 of bupropion as SR. What you do is you take one of those every day for 3 days. After 3 days, you take it twice a day. All right. And if you're a 2D6 poor metabolizer, and we're going to talk about that in a few more episodes, that some people just don't metabolize, that their enzymes don't work as well as other folks. So if you are a 2D6 poor metabolizer, the instruction is to not increase the dose. And that's what's interesting here is this is not an instruction on any other antidepressant that's bupropion doesn't have um, this warning on it. Fluoxetine doesn't have this warning on it. This is something that's we become more aware of, I think, since those medications were approved. But then also the dextromethorphan, there's more risk with it. So if you have increased levels of bupropion because you're a pORD2D6 inhibitor, maybe a little bit less problematic than with the dextromethorphan, with the dissociation and a lot of those symptoms that could occur. All right. Now, this is an expensive medication. It's going to be on patent for a while. It's $1,200 a month on average. However, for $50 a month, you could give them generics, right? You could give them, just like I told you what I did, give them generic dextromethorphan and generic bupropion. And you also have the flexibility of giving them the once daily bupropion XL, and you could give it just in the morning. Maybe there's less problems with sleep, and then you could give them the dextromethorphan all at night, or you could weight it more at night. If you're giving them the 90 milligrams, you give them maybe 30 in the morning and 60 at night. So you're like helping more with their sleepiness. So you'd still have to dose the dextromethorphan twice a day, but you wouldn't have to dose the bupropion twice a day. So you could use the SR bupropion, but you could also not dose them at the same time, because maybe taking the bupropion too late is too stimulating. So there's advantages to this, that you could actually split it up and not have to dose the bupropion twice a day. And also you have more flexibility on the dose you're giving, right? So you could maybe give a higher dose of bupropion, or a lower dose of dextromethorphan. And actually doses of dextromethorphan up to 60 twice a day have been tested. So this is 45 twice a day. You'd have the option of going up to 60 twice a day if you just kind of created it on your own. But as I said, I tried to do this and I found it quite challenging because of the liquid formulations and so forth. However, I was overseas and only had access to a military pharmacy. Most of you have access to the entire country, and there are formulations of just dextromethorphan. In fact, there is a product called Bupropidex, which is a DXM product that does not contain bupropion. So as you can see in the name there, Bupropidex, they're trying to say, oh yeah, this is basically Auvelity, but it's not. It's a formulation of dextromethorphan that is a friendly version and dosing that's easy to combine with bupropion if it's prescribed separately. So the patient, dextromethorphan is cheap. They buy the Bupropidex themselves off the internet. You give them the bupropion, prescribe that. They pick that up at the pharmacy, and then basically you've saved them $1,200 a month, right? Or that you've saved the healthcare system that much money, or maybe their insurance won't pay for this. So there's ways around it, but at the same time, you've got to be careful when you're doing something like this. You're like saying, hey, oh yeah, get this on your own and take it with this. You're taking a little risk on there. So I'm not going to go ahead and advise you to do that. I'm just going to explain how it could be done in case you are inclined to do it, that you could, be aware and do it as safely as possible. So that's that. And what are the advantages and disadvantages? So advantages might work more quickly than other antidepressants and may be more effective, but the evidence is mixed. And then it does offer the unique mechanism of action as an NMDA receptor antagonist in oral form, whereas, so this, when we think about the esketamine, it's only intranasal. It has to be given in the office. It's got the REMS requirements. It's just, a pain in the butt, ketamine, infusions, all this stuff. This is a pill form. So if we're wanting to get that NMDA effect, we've got this available and we can use it as pill form. So a lot of advantages there over some of the other options, but there are a lot of disadvantages. One, cost. This medication is actually ineligible to be generic until 2034. So that's almost 10 years from now. Actually, probably 9.5 because it came out in August. But actually, that probably has nothing to do with the date. But it's going to be 2034. So that's a long time before it's not $1,200 a month. All right. Not everyone has insurance. Not everyone has good insurance. They may not be able to get this. there usually are coupons for these sort of things, but like how long can you use those? How easy are they? The coupons don't work. If you're on Medicare or Medicaid, you can't use coupons. And then Medicare and Medicaid won't cover a lot of medications. So if you're on state insurance, you can't use coupons to get a cheaper price, and you can't get the medications. And this is the case with weight loss drugs, right? I talk a lot about weight loss drugs because I love weight loss. They It's illegal for the government to um, have their insurances pay for weight loss or weight gain medications, and those type of insurances don't allow coupons, and so patients have to pay for it out of pocket, and then they can't. So cost is an issue here. Potential for abuse, right? And now that we can actually take it at home, somebody might take more than they're supposed to, and robo trip essentially off of the pills that you're giving them, where we don't have that risk with the esketamine. um, and then the 2d6 inhibition, not only is that 2d6 inhibition working on dextromethorphan, but it's working on any other medications the patient may be taking, so that's potentially a problem. Then there's this issue that it might not be more effective than other options. So that's the one that really catches me. There's these conflicting reports on both esketamine and Auvelity that showed that they weren't really more effective. Do they work faster? Sure. Maybe. Would it be nice if all our meds worked faster? Sure, it would. But that's another thing I wonder. I wonder, might it be prudent to give this early on to get a quicker effect, but then after 6 weeks, go ahead and transition them to just bupropion alone? Because in the long run, bupropion alone works about the same. I just This just came out a couple years ago. I don't think there's enough data or information on it to really know how much more effective it may or may not be. There's just been a couple studies showing, oh, it is actually better. Oh, it's not actually better. So I don't think we know. I haven't had an opportunity to prescribe this. I mean, if you are in the military system, this is an option. Um, it came out so near the end of my time, I never got to prescribe it. You actually have to, like, I think they have to fail like 4 other meds before they'll let you give them this one. But you can't, in a lot of cases, you can't give them the esketamine, you can't give them ketamine. And so this is an option if they've, for a lot of insurance companies, if they've failed several other antidepressants. So this one, an advantage over esketamine, easier to get, easier to give. Um, you don't have to do the REMS, don't have to do all that stuff. So, but it is as effective as esketamine. Is esketamine even as effective as ketamine? Are these medications even more effective than regular antidepressants? I think we don't quite know. I think with the answer is the same as it is for a lot of things. Some patients may respond better to this than something else, and so having another option, I think, is good. I think on average, they're probably not that much better, but there are patients that they are going to be much better. And I think the great thing about this particular medication is either A, you could make it, by mixing the two yourself, or you could get to the point where the insurance company would cover it. And then this is an easier to prescribe oral form. And, if you've had a patient fail a bunch of stuff, this might be worth giving it a go. Give them an NMDA receptor antagonist. It's, a different mechanism of action than messing with the monoamines. And so I think this is a great option. I think it's exciting. I think it's interesting, and I think it's worth giving it a go. I can't really say, much about it as far as my personal experience with it, because, as I said, I haven't really had much other than that one case where I kind of created it with Prozac. But yeah, I think interesting. And, that's gonna bring us to the end. And the other thing is there are other NMDA receptor antagonists that are coming out on the horizon. And when we talk about, the future of antidepressants, I'll mention some of those. But these are the ones that have come out so far. So there's a lot of interest here. I know a lot of people that swear by the ketamine, right? These ketamine clinics, they're great. I mean, I think out of all of them, ketamine's probably the most effective, but, the least accessible, right? So we just have one more FDA approved antidepressant to talk about the 5-HT1A partial agonist Gepirone ER, aka Exua. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. And I would rate this as my absolute last choice as an antidepressant. And, tune in next time to find out why this medication is at the bottom of my list.